I think they thought it was probably something like the way they'd come to work in the plantations for the British. They took their families. I was talking today to an elderly Tamil gentleman who doesn't speak English at all, who was taken by his father to the railway at 7 years old. And he remembers, sorry, I think he was 9 years old, sorry. He remembers seeing these mass graves, 300 to a grave, and he was talking about all this to me only today. You see, they took even their children and their families with them. And there was nothing for them when they got there. Most promises of money, I think some may have been kept of wages, but by and large the Japanese ignored any agreements. Labourers who were told they were going for 3 months, they stayed for the whole duration. You know, it was not a pleasant experience for most of these people. We have these sort of silenced voices on the part of the Asian community. As I say, all communities in Malaya were affected, but I think it was only the Tamils who took their families and their wives and their children. And you know, I'm sure you've heard that the Japanese army has a very bad reputation for behavior with women. I suppose all armies do to some certain extent, but the Japanese is rather extreme. And I have come across 1 or 2 reports from British prisoners of war of Tamil women, probably Indian women, probably Tamils, who were abused by the Japanese military authorities there sexually. So it's not a pleasant experience. Besides the labour from Malaysia, we have labour from Thailand. They started building the railway, and very quickly they were, I think in December of 1942, the Thai workers attacked the Japanese army camps in Ban Pong and killed 4 people and seriously wounded 2 others. Of course, all Japanese military-related officials. And there was an enormous incident. The Thai Prime Minister sort of quickly rushed away from Bangkok so that he could avoid meeting the demands of the Japanese army, and it was a very important incident. It's called the Ban Pong incident. I think after that time, Japanese demands on labour also increased. Then there are other labourers too. There are Javanese. With the corporal at Aporon says there were about 100,000 of them. Many of the survivors have been interviewed in Java by Japanese television crews and things like that. It's well documented. Burmese, we have many Burmese. One of the labourers was a writer. After the war he became, unlike many labourers, he was literate. After the war he became a very well-known writer, and quite some time after, this was under the Newin government, after he'd become famous, he published his own memoir of his own experiences as labour on the Burmese, on the Thai-Burma railway, the Death Railway. And he says in that memoir that 170,000 Burmese were initially recruited by the Japanese. So what I'm saying here, and I'm talking about these numbers, is not because I know the numbers. I don't. How could anybody possibly know the numbers? But the number of Asians mobilized for labor is much more than the 270,000 that most museums tell us. The museums around the railway, the British government, the Australian government, they all tell us that there are 270,000 labourers were involved. There is much more. And I have reason to believe that it must be at least 500,000 people if we take in Thais, Burmese, and all the rest of it. And I just became concerned, you know. Why were we talking about just Allied prisoners? There were only 60,000 of them, and 13,000 died, and they had a terrible time. But you know, we're talking about people who had absolutely no recourse. And what has happened to these silent voices of history? This was my concern in writing the articles. The conditions under which these people laboured were frightening. You know, there was a lack of food, there was a lack of provision up the railway because some of it was very inaccessible. It was in malarial-infested jungle. In those days, very few Thais lived in that part of the area. It was just so uninhospitable. And no medications, no doctors. The Japanese never provided any medical treatment worthwhile. Occasionally, the military prisoners of war doctors would try to help where they could. And they had absolutely nothing. They couldn't speak English, most of them. They certainly couldn't speak Japanese. How on earth could they communicate? Even if the Japanese had been willing, and I suppose there were some good Japanese soldiers, we do hear of them from time to time in memoirs. How could they communicate? There were no interpreters provided, there was nothing like that. And they were all far from home. They'd been uprooted, and they were often spread in camps where they didn't even know each other's language. So this starts to explain the very high death toll. It was higher among the Asian workers. The prisoner of war accounts also talk about a 25% mortality rate among the Asian workers, which is much higher than the prisoners of war. And this is, of course, because they had no idea how to deal with problems of hygiene in the camps. They had no medications, they had nothing. And you had malaria and tropical ulcers. I think you probably know about those. You know, a little gash can just destroy the leg. There was no cure for that in those days except amputating the leg. And in the monsoon seasons, you got not only malaria and dysentery, but also cholera. And the Japanese were terrified of cholera. They were terrified of catching it themselves. And they would burn anybodies that had died of cholera. And several accounts have suggested that sometimes the people who were burned were not dead. So, you know, they were terrified of it. So, but the graves, especially when you get mass outbreaks of disease, sometimes they weren't buried at all. I've heard instances of Tamil, beg pardon, of Asian workers, I don't know whether they were Tamil or not, being just left where they died, not even put in a grave. But when you had mass outbreaks of disease or disease camps, the Japanese called them hospitals. They would take somebody who was sick and put them in a different place to prevent, I suppose, infecting others. But to call it a hospital is something of a misnomer, to put it mildly. They were just places where the sick were put. And you obviously would get graveyards. You would obviously get a sometimes quite big mass graveyard near to such so-called hospitals. The graveyard in Kanchanaburi that was discovered in 1990, and there had been many more before, and there have been since, I think in a similar location. I think the last one was in 2006, but I may be wrong, maybe it's 2008. But the 1991 was very important because there were many Thais then who still remembered seeing what had happened. And they talked about how this area had been a camp for the Asian workers, just as the prisoners' work camps, there were Asian camps. And how they saw people from the camps being brought to be buried in these mass graves, sometimes as many as 10 a day. And they testified that at that time there were many Tamils involved. There were children. One of my slides shows a skeleton of less than 10 years old, and this child still had bangles on her legs that must have been taken as part of a Tamil family. And so we suppose, but we don't know, that there may be many, many more such graveyards around in Kanchanaburi. The only reason that some of these have come to light is because they're on private property. Some people in the area remember and are worried about the ghosts. You know how in Thailand spirits and ghosts are everywhere. And these are some of the motives behind the rediscovering of the bodies. Please understand, there has been no official attempt by anybody at all to try to locate the full extent of the burials of Asian workers. The Thai government or any other governments concerned have never ever tried to deal with a systematic investigation